The Blue Sword by Robin McKinley. Chapter 1. She scowled at her glass of orange juice. To think she had been delighted when she first arrived here. Was it only just 3 months ago? With the prospect of fresh orange juice every day? But she had been eager to be delighted. This was to be her home, and she wanted badly to like it. To be grateful for it, to behave well, and to make her brother proud of her, and Sir Charles and Lady Amelia pleased with her generosity. Their generosity. Lady Amelia had explained when the orchards, only a few days south and west of here, were the finest in the country, and many of the oranges she had seen at home before she came out here had probably come from those same orchards. It was hard to believe in orange groves as she looked out the window, across the flat desultory plain beyond the Residency, unbroken by anything more vigorous than a few patches of harsh grass and stunted sand-colored bushes, until it disappeared at the feet of the black and copper-brown mountains. But there was fresh orange juice every day. She was the first down to the table every morning, and gently teased by Lady Amelia and Sir Charles about her healthy young appetite. But it wasn't hunger that drove her out of bed so early. Since her days were empty of purpose, she could not sleep well when night came, and by dawn each morning she was more than ready for the maid to enter her room, push back the curtains from the tall windows, and hand her a cup of tea. She was often out of bed when the woman arrived, and dressed, sitting at her window, for her bedroom window faced the same direction as the breakfast room, staring at the mountains. The servants thought kindly of her, as she gave them little extra work, but a lady who rose and dressed herself so early and without assistance was certainly a little eccentric. They knew of her impoverished background. That explained a great deal. But she was in a fine house now, and her host and hostess were only too willing to give her anything she might want, as they had no children of their own. She might try a little harder to adapt to so pleasant an existence. She did try. She knew what the thoughts behind the looks the servants gave her were. She had dealt with servants before, but she was adapting to her new life as best as her energetic spirit could. She might have screamed and hammered on the walls with her fists, or jumped over the low window-sill in her room, clambered to the ground by the ivy trellis, special ivy bred to withstand the desert heat, and carefully watered by Sir Charles's garden every day, and run off towards the mountains. But she was trying the best to be good, so she was merely first to the breakfast table. Sir Charles and Lady Amelia were all that was kind to her, and she was fond after a few weeks in their company. They had indeed been far more than kind. When her father died a year ago, Richard, a very junior military adjutant, had laid the difficulty of an unmarried sister and an entailed estate before Sir Charles, and begged for advice. She heard all this, to her acute embarrassment, from Richard, who wanted to be sure she understood how much she had to be grateful for. He and his wife had said they would be happy to offer her a home with them, and Richard, too relieved to think hard about the propriety of such a godsend, had written to her and said, "Come out." He had not specifically said, "Mind your manners," but she understood what to do. She hadn't any choice. She had known, because her father had told her 5 years ago, when her mother died, that she would have no inheritance, what money there had been tied up very strictly for their eldest son. "Not that Dickie will mistreat you," their father had said with the ghost of a smile, "but I feel that with your temperament you had best have as long as possible a warning to resign yourself to it. You'll like being dependent on your brother even less, I fancy, than you like being dependent on me." He tapped his fingers on his desk. The thought that lay silent between them did not need to be spoken aloud. It was not likely she would marry. She was proud, and if she had not been, her parents would have been proud for her. And there is little market for penniless blue bloods of no particular beauty, especially when the blueness of the blood is suspected to have been diluted by a questionable great-grandmother on the mother's side. What the questionableness exactly consisted of, Harry was not sure. With the self-centeredness of childhood, she had not thought to ask, and later, after she realized that she did not care for society, nor society for her, she had no desire to ask. The shipboard journey east on the Cecilia had been long but uneventful. She had found her sea legs almost at once, and had made friends with a middle-aged lady, also travelling alone, who asked no personal questions, and loaned her novels freely to her young companion, and discussed them with her upon their return. She let her mind go numb and had read the novels and sat in the sun and strolled the decks and not thought about the past or the future. They docked at Starzara without mishap, and she found the earth heaved under her strangely when she first set foot ashore. Richard had been granted a month's leave to meet her and escort her north to her new home. He looked younger than she had expected. He had gone overseas 3 years ago and had not been home again since. He was affectionate to her at the reunion, but wary. They seemed to have little in common any more. I shouldn't be surprised, she thought. It had been a long time since we played together each day. Before Dickie was sent off to school, I'm an encumbrance now, and he had his career to think of. But it would be nice to be friends, she thought wistfully. When she pressed him to give her some idea of what she could expect of her new life, he shrugged and said, "You'll see. The people are like home, you know. You didn't have much to do with the natives. There are other servants, of course, but they are all right. Don't worry about it." And he looked at her with so worried a face that she didn't know whether to laugh or shake him. He said, "I wish you would tell me what is worrying you." Variations of this conversation occurred several times during the first days of their journey together. At this point, there would be a long silence. Finally, as if he could bear it no more, he burst out, "You won't be able to go on as you did at home, you know." "But what do you mean?" She hadn't thought much about native servants or her position, and yet, obviously, Richard knew her well enough of old to guess that now. She had written him letters, several each year since he had gone overseas, but he had rarely answered. She had not minded very much, although she had thought occasionally, as when his 6 hastily scrawled lines at Christmas arrived, that would have been pleasant if he had been a better correspondence. But it hadn't troubled her. It troubled her now, for he knew that she was facing a stranger who perhaps knew too much about her and her accustomed way of life. She blinked at him and tried to rearrange her thoughts. She was excited, but she was frightened too. And Richard was all she had. The memory of her father's funeral, and she the only family member standing beside the minister, and of the small handful of servants and tenants whom she had known in her life and who were far away from her now, was still raw and recent. She didn't want to think about her new life. She wanted time to ease into it gradually. She wanted to pretend that she was a tourist. Dick, what do you mean?" Richard must have seen her homesick bewilderment on her face. He looked back at her unhappily. "Oh, it's just not your house. It's not your house, you know. Of course I know. I appreciate the Greenoughs are doing for you and for me by taking me in," she said carefully. "You explained it all to me in your letter." He nodded. "Do you think I don't know how to behave myself?" she said at last, goaded and rewarded by another long silence, when she felt the blood rising in her face. "It's not that I don't think you know how," he said at last. She flinched, and he began. "Harry," he said firmly, "I am still Harry." He looked at her with dismay, and she realized she was confirming his fears about her. But she wasn't going to yield about that, of all things. The realization that she would insist on being called Harry seemed to silence him. But he did not try to reason with her further, and withdrew into his corner seat and stared out the window. She could tell by his voice that he did not want to hurt her, but he was truly apprehensive. She and Richard had been wild animals together as small children, but when Dickie had been packed off to school, her mother had dragged her into the house almost by the nape of her neck and her ears, and begun the long difficult process of reforming her in something resembling a young lady. "I suppose I should have started years ago," she told her sulky daughter, "but you were having such a good time, and I knew Dickie would be sent away soon. I thought it hardly fair that your lesson should start sooner." This lifted the cloud a little from her mom's brow, so she added with a smile, "And besides, I've always liked riding horses and climbing trees and falling into ponds better myself." After such an open avowal of sympathy from the enemy, lessons could never be quite as awful. On the other hand, they were not perhaps as thorough as they might have been. On particularly beautiful days, they often packed a lunch and rode out together, mother and daughter, to inspire themselves, the mother said, with a little fresh air. But the books as often as not stayed in the saddlebags all day. The daughter learned to love books, particularly adventure novels, where the hero rode a beautiful horse and ran all the villains through with a silver sword. But her embroidery was never above passable, and she only learned to dance after her mother pointed out that such grace and balance as she might learn on the dance floor would doubtless stand her in good stead in the saddle. She learned the housekeeping necessary in an old ramshackle country house well enough to take over the management when theirs successfully during her mother's last illness, and the first horrible months after her mother's death were made easier by the fact that she had something to do, and the first pain of loss wore away. She realized that she liked being useful. In the shock 5 years later of her father's death, and with the knowledge that she must leave her home and leave it in the indifferent hands of a business manager, it occurred to her to be relieved that the little eastern station at the farthest flung border of the Homelander Empire, where Richard had been posted and where she was about to join him, was as small and isolated as it was. Her mother had escorted her to such small parties and small social occasions as their country neighborhood might offer, and she knew she had conducted herself creditably. She had not enjoyed herself. For one thing, she was simply too big, taller than all the women, taller than most of the men. Harry could get nothing more useful out of her brother about his private misgivings of the rickety train carried them north, so she began to ask general questions, tourist questions about her new country, and then she had better luck. Richard began to visibly thaw, for he recognized the sincerity of her interest, and he told her quite cheerfully that the town at the end of their journey, where Sir Charles and Lady Amelia awaited them, was the only town of any size within 3 days of it. There's a wireless station in the middle of nowhere, and where the train stops, it exists only for the train to have something to stop at, and that's all. The town's name was Ishtan, after the natives' Ishitan, which was deemed too hard to pronounce. Beyond Ishtan was a scattering of small depressed cottages and carefully irrigated fields where the tough local tassel-headed grain called korf was grown. Ishtan had been a small village before the Homelanders came, where the farmers and herders and nomads from the surrounding country came to market every fortnight, and a few pot-menders and rug-weavers kept shops. The Homelanders used it as an outpost and expanded it, though the native market remained at its center, and built a fort on the eastern end of it, which was named the General Leonard Ernst Mundy. Ishtan had lately become a place of some importance to the governmental network of the Homelanders, and had laid over the country they had conquered 80 years before. It was still an isolated spot, and no one went there who didn't have to, for it was the edge of the northern desert of the peninsula connected it was the edge of the great northern desert of the peninsula continent the Homelanders called Daria. But 13 years ago, the Ariel mines had been discovered in the Raman Mountains to the northwest, and in the 8 years the mines had been officially declared the most profitable discovery on the entire Darian continent, and that was saying a great deal. The profits on oranges alone paid the wages of half the civil servants in the province. The mines are awful to get to, though. The Ramita are very nasty going. Ishtan is the only feasible route to the mines, and it is the last town large enough to resupply any caravan or company going that way or coming out again. That's why we've got the railroad, finally. Before that, we were the only reason anyone would want to come so far, and our attractions are limited, but the mines are the big thing now. They may even figure out a way to dig a road through the Ramids. I wish them luck. Ishtan also remained tactically important, for while south of the boundary to Homelander territory swung rapidly east, the Homelanders failed to push it back any nearer the mountains of the north and the east. The natives, perhaps from learning to cope with the desert to survive it all, had proved to be tougher breed than their southern cousins. Some of this Harry had read at home when she had first heard of Richard's posting 3 years before, but she felt the reality of it now, and the western wind blowing down on her from the rich Aral mines, and the odd greenish bronze tint in the sky, and the brilliant red of the sunsets. She saw the dull brown uniforms of the Homelander soldiers stationed there, and the red stripe vertically drawn over the red breast that indicated they served in the Darian province of the Homelander sovereignty. There are more soldiers the further they traveled. It's still a sore point that Ishtan is the eastern frontier. We can't seem to bear the idea that the border doesn't run straight north to south because we would like it to. They keep threatening to mount new offenses. But Colonel Denham, he's in charge of the Old Mundy, says they won't do it, and who wants to own a lot of desert anyway? It's the farmland to the south and the mines that make it worthwhile to be here. She encouraged him to talk about Her Majesty's government of the Royal House of Daria, and she did not listen as closely as she might have to the description of the ranks and duties of the civil servants Richard had the most contact with. She arrived at Ishtan at last with some small idea of how Homelanders in general were expected to respond in Daria, and she had seen Korf with her own eyes, a band of the wandering tinkers known as the Dibadi, and the changing color of the earth underfoot, from the southern red to central brown to the northern yellow-gray. She knew a brown-leafed Ipsen tree from the blue evergreen tortuk, and when Lady Amelia met her with the corsage of the little rosy pink pimchi flowers, she greeted them by name. Lady Amelia was a small brown woman with big hazel eyes and curly gray hair and the wistful look of fading beauty. Her husband, Sir Charles, was as tall as Richard and much broader. He must have rode 16 stone, Harry thought dispassionately as she shook his hand. He had a red face and white hair and a magnificent mustache, and if his blue eyes were a little shallow, there were laugh lines generously around them, and all his smile was warm. He felt as if they had looked forward to her coming, and she relaxed a little. There was none of the loftiness she was expecting of a poor relation, someone else's poor relation at that. Sir Charles, during the first evening, gave her a complete history of Daria, its past, its conquest by the Homelanders, its present, and its likely future, but most of it she was too tired to follow. Lady Amelia's occasional quick comments, then her husband stopped to draw breath, but Harry's present comfort were much more welcome, though she tried not to show it. But midway through the evening, as Sir Charles was gesturing with his liqueur glass, and even Richard was looking a bit glassy-eyed, Lady Amelia caught her new charge's eye for a long moment. A look of patience and affection passed between them, and Harry thought that perhaps it would be well, and she went up to bed in good spirits. For the first few days in Ishtan, she unpacked and looked around her, and she only saw the newness of everything. But the Homelanders of Ishtan were a small but thriving community, and she was the latest addition to society, which looked forward to and welcomed and cross-examined and talked about its additions. She had always suffered from a vague restlessness, a longing for adventure, and she told herself severely was the result of reading too many novels when she was a small child. As she grew up, and particularly after her mother died, she learned to ignore the restlessness. She had nearly forgotten about it until now. She wondered sometimes if her brother felt that impatience of spirit too. It was something like it had had anything to do with him ending up at a small border station, however tactically important, although his prospects when he graduated from university had suggested something better. This was one of the many things she did not ask him. Another question she did not ask is if he ever missed home. She set down her empty orange juice glass and sighed. They'd missed the orange groves coming north from Tatsara, where her ship put her ashore. She picked up her fork from its shining white, neatly folded linen napkin and turned it so that the sunlight glittered through the orange juice, now caught in tiny starbursts across its tines. Don't fidget, she told herself. This morning she was to go riding with two Mrs. Petersons, Cassie and Elizabeth. They were near her own age and the admitted beauties of the station. The entire 4th Cavalry stationed at General Mundi were in love with them, but they were also cheerful and open-hearted, and she was fond of them. She had never much cared for beauty, although she was aware that she lacked it, and her position might have been a little easier if she had not. They would return from the ride by mid-morning, because the sun would be growing too hot for anyone to brave it for pleasure. She planned to ask Lady Amelia if they might all come back for lunch. She already knew that the answer would be, "Why, of course. We are always delighted to see them. I'm so pleased, my dear, that you should be so clever as to attach the two most charming girls we have here to be your particular friends." Harry caught herself playing with her fork again and laid it down empathetically. This evening there was to be another dance. Richard had promised to escort her. She had to acknowledge that, however little they found to say to one another, he was very good about escorting her to parties and dancing with her, which meant that there was at least one man present whom she did not tower over. Her gratitude was not all dimmed by the suspicion that he was nursing a secret passion for Cassie, or nor by the thought, even a real suspicion, that he might not want himself made fool of by his sister's unpopularity. No, his kindness was real. He loved her, she thought, in his silent and anxious way. Perhaps simply being a very junior military adjunct, with an unmarried sister thrust into one's hands, inevitably made one a bit of a prig. It never occurred to her to speculate whether any of the young men and their shining regimentals that Dickie painstakingly introduced her to, and who then painstakingly asked her to dance, presented themselves from any more motive outside of willingness to do their friend Crewe a favor by standing up with his oversized sister. It might have surprised her very much to learn of her 2 or 3 admirers, who so far resisted the prevailing atmosphere of the barracks as to incline to an altar less populated than that of either Miss Peterson. "But she's just like her brother," one of them complained to his best friend, who listened with the friend's patience, although he was himself incapable of seeing the charms of any woman other than Beth Peterson. So damn polite. Oh, she's nice enough, you know. I don't suppose she actually dislikes me, he continued a bit uncertainly, but I'm not at all sure she even recognizes me from one day to the next, so it hardly counts. Well, said the friend good-naturedly, Dick remembers you well enough. The admirer threw a boot at his friend, the one he hadn't polished yet. You know what I mean. I know what you mean, agreed the friend. A cold fish. The admirer looked up from the boot, blackening angrily, and the friend held up the extra boot like a shield. Dick's stiff with honor. I dare say a sister's like that. You just don't know her well enough yet. Balls, dinner parties, mourned the admirer. You know what they're like. It's like it'll take years. The friend, in silent sympathy, thinking of Beth, tossed the boot back, and he began moodily to blacken it. The object of his affections, had she known of this conversation, would have agreed with him on the subject of balls and dinner parties. In fact, she would have added the writer that she wasn't sure if it could be done at all, getting to know someone at any succession of parties, however prolonged. And the friend was right about Dick Crew's powerful sense of honor. He knew very well that at least two of his friends were falling in love with his sister, but it never crossed his mind to say anything about them to her. He could not compromise the privileged knowledge of friendship in such a way. And Dick's sister, oblivious to the fact that she had won herself a place in the station hierarchy, chafed and fidgeted. Lady Amelia arrived at the breakfast table next. They had just settled the question of Cassie and Beth coming to lunch, and almost the precise words anticipated. And then the door to Sir Charles's study across the hall from the breakfast room opened, and Sir Charles and his secretary, Mr. Mortimer, entered to breakfast. The two women looked at them in surprise. They had the unmistakable air of men who have been awake several hours, working on nothing more than a cup of coffee or two of the dark, heavy local coffee, who had to rush through their meal, and now to get back to whatever they had been doing. Neither of them looked very happy about their prospects. My dear, said Lady Amelia, what is wrong? Sir Charles ran a hand through his white hair, accepted a plate of eggs with the other, and sat down. He shook his head. Philip Mortimer glanced at his employer and said nothing. Richard's not here yet, said Sir Charles, as if his absence explained everything. Richard? And said Lady Amelia faintly. Yes, said Colonel Denham. I'm sorry, my dear, he said. A few mouthfuls of eggs seemed to restore him. The message came quite out of the blue, in the middle of the night. He explained to the metaphors as well as his mouthful. Jack, Colonel Denham has been out, trying to find out what he can, and I told him to come to breakfast and tell us what he's learned. With Richard, that boy knows how to talk to people, blast him. Blast him, he'll be here in a few hours. His wife stared at him in complete bewilderment, and his young guest averted her eyes when he looked at her as if it was not her place to stare. He laid down his fork and laughed. Melly, your face is a study. Young Harry here is going to be a fine ambassador's wife some day, though. Look at that poker face. You really shouldn't look so much like your brother. It makes you just too easy to read for those of us who know him. Just now you're thinking, is this old man gone at last? Humor him till we're sure. If he calms down a bit, perhaps we'll get some sense out of him yet. Harry grinned back at him, untroubling by his teasing, and he reached across the table, braving candlesticks and an artistically arranged bowl of fruit, to tap her cheek with his fingers. A general's wife, on second thought. You'll be wasted on the diplomatic corps. They're all such dry paper shufflers. He speared a piece of toast with his fork, and Lady Amelia, whose manners with her own family were as punctilious as if she dined with royalty, looked away. Sir Charles piled marmalade on his toast until it began to ooze off the edges, added one more dollop for good measure, and ate it all in 3 gulps. Melly, I know I've told you about the difficulties we're having up in the north, on the side of the mountains with our lot, and on the north side with whatever it is they breed over there. A very queer bunch, but from all we can gather, it's all begun to escalate this last year at alarming speed. Harry, Dick's told you something of it? She nodded. You may or may not know that our real hold over Daria ends just about where the station stands, though technically, on paper, homeland rule extends far to the foot of those mountains north and east of here, the Ossanders, which run out from the Ramids, and then that far eastern range you see over the sand, where none of us has ever been. Those mountains are the only bits of the old kingdom of Damar, still under native rule. There used to be quite a lot of fighting along this border, say 40 years ago, but since their king, oh yes, there's a king, more or less ignores us, and we more or less ignore him. But odd things, call them odd things, Jack will tell you what he thinks they are, still happen on that plain or no man's land, so we have the fourth Callery here with us. Nothing too odd has happened since the current king took the throne around 10 years ago, we think. They don't bother to keep us up to date on such things, but it never does to be careless. He frowned, and while frowning, ate another piece of toast. Everything has been quiet for at least 15 years, nearly as long as I've been here, and that's a long time. Ask Jack, though, for the stories of what it was like up and down the northern half of this border before that. He lifted the curtains farther back as he looked across the desert, as if the breadth of view might assist clarity of thought. It was obvious his mind was not on the explanation he was giving. For all his assumed cheerfulness, he was deeply worried. Damn, excuse me, where is Jack? I expected he would have been at least sent young Richard on ahead now. He spoke as if to himself, or perhaps to Philip Mortimer, who made soothing noises, poured a cup of tea, and took it to Sir Charles, where he stood squinting into the morning light. Trouble, said Lady Amelia gently. More trouble? Sir Charles dropped the curtain and looked around. Yes, more trouble. He looked at his hands and realized he was holding a cup of tea in one of them, and took a swallow from it with the air of a man who does what is expected of him. There may be war with the North. Jack thinks so. I'm not sure, but I don't like the rumors. We must secure the passes through the mountains, particularly Ricker's Gap, which gives anybody coming through it almost a direct line to Ishtan, and then, of course, to the whole province. It may only be some treble-up war, but it could be war as real as it was 80 years ago. There aren't that many of the old Demarians left, the hill folk, but we've been forced to have a pretty healthy respect for them, and if King Corlys decides to throw his chances in with the Northerners. There was a clatter in the street below. Sir Charles' head snapped back. There they are at last, he said, and bolted for the front door and threw it open himself under the scandalized eyes of the butler, who had emerged from the inner sanctum just too late. Come in. I've been in high fidgets for the last hour, wondering what's become of you. Have you found out anything that might be use of us? I have been trying to explain to the ladies what our problem is. Would anyone care for breakfast? Lady Amelia asked without haste, with her usual placid courtesy. Charles may be trying to explain that so far he has not succeeded. In response to her gesture, a maid laid 2 more places at the table. With a jingling of spurs, the 2 latecomers entered and apologized for the dirt, and were delighted to accept some breakfast. Richard dropped a perfunctory kiss on her sister's cheek, at his way to the eggs and ham. After a minute of tea pouring and butter passing, while Sir Charles strode up and down the room with a barely suppressed impatience, it was Lady Amelia who spoke first. We will leave you to your business, which I can see is very important. We won't pester you with demands for explanations, but will you answer just one question? Colonel Denham said, Of course, Melly. What is it? What is it that has suddenly thrown you into a turmoil? Some unexpected visitor? I gathered from what Charles said. Denham stared at her. He didn't tell you? Good God, it's Corlys himself. He's coming. He never comes here, you know. None of the real hill folk do if they can help it. And at best, if we want badly enough to talk to him, we can catch one of his men as they pass through the foothills northeast of here. Sometimes, you see, broke in Sir Charles, it makes us hope that perhaps he wishes to cooperate with us, not the Northerners. Jack, did you find out anything? Didlum shrugged. Not really. Nothing that we didn't already know. And his coming here is unprecedented, to say the least. And that it is, in fact, him. No one has any better guesses than ours about why, suddenly, he decided to do so. But your guess would be, prompted Sir Charles. Denham shrugged again and looked away. You know, although already what my guess would be. You just like to hear me making an ass of myself, but I believe in the, curious things that happen out there. He raved the sugar spoon. And I believe that Corlys must have had some sort of sign to go to the length of approaching us. Silence fell. Harry could see that everyone else in the room was uncomfortable. Sign? She said tentatively. Denham glanced at his quiet smile. You haven't been here long enough to hear of any of the queer stories about the old rulers of Damar? No, she said. Well, they were sorcerers, or so the story goes, magicians. They would call the lightning down on the heads of their enemies, that sort of thing. Useful stuff for founding an empire. Sir Charles snorted. No, you're quite right. All we had was matchlocks and enthusiasm. Even magic wanes, I suppose, but I don't think it's waned quite away yet. There are still some living in those mountains out there. Corlys can trace his bloodlines back to Aaron and Tor, who ruled Damar in the Golden Age, with or without magic, depending on which version you prefer. If they're legends themselves, put in Sir Charles. Yes, but I believe they're real, said Jack Dedham. I even believe they wield something we prosaic Homelanders would call magic. Harry looked at him fascinated, and his smile broadened. I'm quite used to being taken for a fool around here. It's doubtless part of the reason I'm still a colonel and still at the General Mundy. But there are a number of us old soldiers whose memories go back to Daria of 30-40 years ago who say the same thing. Oh, magic, said Charles disgustedly, but there was a trace of uneasiness in his voice. Have you ever seen lightning come down to heel like a dog? Dedham thought his politeness looked a little stubborn. No, I haven't. But it's true enough, at least, that the men who have gone up against Cornwallis's father and grandfather were plagued by the most astounding bad luck. And you know the Queen and Council back home would give their eye teeth to push our borders back the way we've been saying we would for the last 80 years. Bad luck, said Lady Amelia. I've heard the stories, of course. Some of the old ballads are beautiful, but what sort of bad luck? Dedham smiled again. Admit, it does begin to sound foolish when one tries to explain it, but things like rifles or matlocks, misfiring or blowing up, not just a few, but many, yourself and your neighbor and his neighbor and their neighbors, in a cavalry charge just as it reaches full stretch, the horses begin to trip and fall back as if they've forgotten how to gallop. All of them. Men mistake their orders, supply wagons lose their wheels, half a company all suddenly get grit in their eyes simultaneously and can't see where they're going or where to shoot. The sort of things that always happen, but carried far beyond probability. Men get superstitious about such things, however much they scoff at elves and witches and so on. It's pretty appalling to see your cavalry crumple up like they're all drunk, and then these madmen with nothing but swords and axes amidst the leather armor are coming down on you from every direction. No one seems to be firing at them from your side. I assure you, I've seen it. Richard shifted in his chair. And Corlynth, yes, Corlynth, the colonel sounded still as unruffled as when he thanked Lady Amelia for his cup of tea. While Sir Charles' face was getting redder and redder, and he whiffled through his mustache, it was hard not to believe Dedham. His voice was too level, and it rang with sincerity. They say in Corlynth the old kings have come out again. You know, he's begun to unite some of the outlying tribes, the ones who didn't seem to owe anyone any particular allegiance, and who live by a sort of equal-handed brigandry on anyone within easy reach. Yes, I know, said Sir Charles. Then you may also have heard some of the other sort of stories they begun to tell about him. I imagine he can call lightning to heel if he feels like it. This is the man who's coming here today? Said Lady Amelia, and even now she sounded a little startled. Yes, Amelia, I'm afraid so. If he's so blasted clever, said Sir Charles, what does he want from us? Dedham laughed. Come on, Charles, don't be sulky. I don't suppose even a magician can take 500,000 northerners disappear like raindrops in the ocean. We certainly need him to keep the passes through his mountains closed, and it may be that he has decided he needs us to mop up the leaks perhaps. Lady Amelia stood up, and Harry reluctantly followed her. We will leave you to discuss it. Is there anything I could arrange? I'm afraid I know very little about entertaining chieftains. Do you suppose he would want lunch? She spread her hands and looked around the table. Harry suppressed a smile at the thought of proper little Lady Amelia offering sandwiches with the crust neatly trimmed off and lemonade to this barbarian king. What would he look like, she thought. I've never seen any of the free men, the hill folk. All the natives at the station, even the merchants from away, looked subdued and a little worried. Oh, bosh, said Sir Charles. I wish I knew what he wanted, lunch or anything else. Part of what makes all this so complicated is that what we know of the free hill folk have a very complicated code of honor, but we know almost nothing about what it consists of. Almost, murmured Dedham. We could offer them we could offer them mortally and not we could offend them mortally and not even know it. I don't know if Corlynth is coming alone or with a select band of his 1,000 best men, armed to the teeth and carrying lightning bolts in their back pockets. Now, Charles, Dedham said, we've invited him here because the fort is not built for receiving guests of honor, Dedham said, and easily as Sir Charles paused. And, Sir Charles said plaintively, it doesn't look so quite warlike here. Dedham laughed. But 4 o'clock in the morning, Sir Charles said. I think we should be thankful that it occurred to him to give us any more warning at all. I don't believe it's the sort of thing he's accustomed to having to think about. The colonel stood up, and Richard promptly took the place behind him. Sir Charles was still pacing about the room, cup in hand, as the ladies prepared to leave. My apologies for spoiling your morning to no purpose, said Colonel Denham. Our day, sir, he will arrive some time, and we will deal with him. But I don't think you need to put yourselves out. His message merely said that he desired an audience with the Homelander District Commissioner. Not quite his phrase, but that's the idea. And the general of the fort. He'll have to make do with me, since we don't rate a general. The Hillkeens don't go in much for gold plate and red velvet anyway. I hope this is a business meeting. I hope so too, murmured Sir Charles to his teacup, and at the moment we can't do much more than wait and see, said the Colonel. Have some more of this excellent tea, Charles. What's in your cup must be quite cold by now. End of chapter 1.